Hi, SOCA1010 students. Welcome to week 2 of the course. So this week we are kind of building on the introductory lecture that Steve gave last week to speak a bit about sociological theory. So I thought I would start the lecture this week by talking to you a little bit about why we theorize, the role of social theory, sociological theory in sociology and the social sciences more generally. Because one of the questions that is often asked, especially at the start of this week of the course, is why do we have to cover theory? What's the importance of theory? It can seem a little bit off-putting because theory has a reputation as being like very confusing, very complex, but I'd like to take this time to explain to you some of the foundations of theory, because I think if we have a good sense of why we theorize, the role of sociological theory in sociology and the social sciences more generally, then it seems much less complex and much more important. So after I've kind of done my kind of introductory explanatory spiel, we're going to be talking this week about classical sociological theory in the first half of this lecture, and then in the second half we're going to be focusing on more contemporary sociological theories, so probably the theory that you're going to end up using in your essays for this course, if not throughout your entire degree. So just to begin, why theorize? What's the point of theory within the sociological endeavour? So in the most simple, straightforward way possible, social theory can be used to examine the taken for granted assumptions about everything that we see in society. So a really good example of this is the very concept of money. So money itself is an abstract entity that is kind of underpinned by an agreement that is constructed in society, socially constructed. So money, as in our banknotes or numbers on a screen, would essentially have no value if we did not all socially agree that it has value. And so by observing this very simple fact, we've essentially deconstructed money, and we've therefore very roughly and quickly kind of built a constructivist sociological theory. And I'll explain, we'll get to a bit more to what something like constructivism means, but the important thing for now is that social theory is not just something dense and complicated that you come across in a textbook. It's a tool that we can use to help us look behind the nature of the social world, help us to make the familiar look strange, and kind of help us to undertake the sociological endeavour. So in that sense, it's very important and can be very useful and can help us to unpack aspects of our everyday lives. Theory essentially provides a set of tools for the sociologists to examine the social world. And so just thinking a little bit about the kind of nature of social theory, we can compare it to some theory that you might come across in the physical sciences. So in the physical sciences, theory is built on a set of hypotheses. So a scientist like Isaac Newton might hypothesize, if I hold this apple up in the air and then let it go, it will fall down to the ground, kind of as he did when he was hypothesizing the nature of gravity. And so to test this hypothesis, he could then experiment by doing just that, holding an apple and letting it go. And he could then build upon this theory by experimenting further, by trying to drop the apple from a higher distance, a shorter distance, to see if it falls more quickly, more slowly, all of those types of things. And then other scientists, maybe in different parts of the world, could replicate his experiment and test his hypotheses again to ensure that his study can be replicated and is therefore reliable. So we can compare this type of theory building and then like hypothesis testing to the type of approaches that we take in sociology, which can look quite different, even though in some ways they're doing somewhat similar things, testing assumptions and ideas. So we can do this by looking at the sociological question, why does being poor increase the chance of bad health and of early death? And so this question, much like the hypothesis about the apple falling to the ground, suggests a kind of cause and effect relationship that A equals B. But we can't really rely on this relationship in the same way that a physical scientist could rely on dropping an apple and knowing that it's going to fall to the ground. The complexity of society is quite great, and the kind of variation among humans, among our societies, is pretty expansive. And so to kind of test this hypothesis and try to unpack the nature of cause and effect and try to figure out, why are people who are living in conditions of poverty more likely to experience negative health outcomes and have a shorter life expectancy. So we can do this by, for instance, using a kind of combination of observation, of the sociological imagination, of theories developed by other people to try to understand these relationships. And because sociology uses this approach, observing, trying to use theory, the kind of outcomes and the theories that come from this are often descriptive, trying to describe what they see and use that as a basis of explaining it. They're often contextual and relational, so they pertain to a specific social context. They're not able to be universally applied because we know that human societies vary enormously cross-culturally. So we wouldn't know intuitively that it's very difficult to apply theories just wholesale from one society to another. So we kind of know that we can find some indications of important factors, important variables when it comes to trying to explain the relationship between poverty and negative health outcomes, but we can't necessarily say that if someone is poor, they are going to 100% have bad health outcomes, whereas you can 100% say that if you drop an apple, it will fall to the ground. So the kind of nature of the way that we use theory, the way that we create theory, the way that we test theory is just a little bit different in sociology. So we can look at lots and lots of different factors. We can look at how poverty limits choices. We can look at how people in different locations might have different health outcomes. We can look at the role that gender plays, the role that social class plays, the role that advertising plays. We also need to define our terms. What exactly do we mean by poverty? How do you measure poverty? Where is a cutoff point? How could we apply this definition cross-culturally in different countries, different societies? So there's a great deal of complexity. And then finally, we have questions about the position of the researcher. So does the researcher have a background that's quite similar to those that they're researching? Are they going to get honest answers from those they're conducting research with? Does their own life and position as a member of the society impact on how they're going to understand the numbers that they're seeing or the words that they're listening to? So from this particular example, you can probably see that sociological research can get very, very complicated. And this is one of the reasons why we use theory. We use theory to help us to interpret what we see in the world, to help us to generate hypotheses or have some idea of what we're likely to find in the world. We use it to help us to understand what might be important to focus on, and how, whether that would be focusing on gender or focusing on power or anything else. Yeah, so I hope that gives you an explanation of why we're looking at sociological theory, despite the fact that the term theory can, as it says here, strike fear into the heart of students. And we often do receive some questions about the relevance of theory, its role in your degrees, and all of that. So really, I want to emphasize that theory is important because it helps us to understand real world problems, and it helps us to kind of have a starting point and a way of interpreting what we see. It's very much central to the sociological endeavour. So as I mentioned today, I'm going to be going through some kind of classical approaches to sociological theory and then some contemporary approaches. And there will be a lot of names and a lot of terms, and I'm not expecting you to remember all of this. That's completely unrealistic. So please do not expect that of yourself. I would really just like if you could come away from this lecture with a broad sense of some of the general moves that are being made in classic and contemporary sociological theory. And please rest assured, we're going to be revisiting these theorists as we work through the course. So this is really, a kind of foundational lecture to give you a first taste of some of these kind of theorists and ideas. This is not the definitive word on these theorists and these approaches. So please don't put pressure on yourself to remember absolutely everything. Just focus on the kind of high level categorizations that I'm going to put forward, such as critical or conflict theorists, functionalist theorists, interpretivist theorists, because those will help you to have a sense of where all of our different theorists sit in relation to each other, and be able to, it'll help you to kind of put them in a box in your head. So I'll leave this part here for now, and I'll move on and talk to you a bit about classical sociological theory.